Hey everybody, Yankee here. The other day I did a video where I did a pretty deep dive comparison between my Smith & Wesson 686 Plus and my new Colt Python. In that video, I looked at both guns up close, inside and out. I tried to show people where they're similar, where they're different, how they stack up to each other build quality-wise, finish-wise, design-wise, etc. And if you haven't seen that video, I'll link it in the upper corner because, it's a technical video. Most people don't watch those, so I thought I'd try to get a few more views on it. But in that video's comment section, a lot of people asked me, hey, will you do the same thing, but instead of comparing the 686 to the Python, would you compare it to the Ruger GP100? A lot of people are always trying to decide, should I get the Smith or should I get the Ruger? So today I want to take a quick look at these two direct competitors, the 686 Plus and the GP100, and see how they stack up to each other inside and out. All right, let's start off looking at the exterior of the gun, seeing where they're similar and where they differ, and let's start up front with the barrels. If you look at the barrels of both guns here, you'll see they're very similar designs. There's nothing groundbreakingly different between them. They both have a substantial top rib. They both have a full underlug, although the Ruger does have a little bit more of an angled cut on that underlug, and the Smith & Wesson is more flush with the front of the barrel, but still very similar designs. Now, one difference you'll notice here is the ejector rods and the little channel they sit in. The ejector rod on the Ruger is much simpler. It's just a metal rod. It doesn't have any of the knurling or polishing that the Smith & Wesson has. The Smith & Wesson rod is just a little more engineered, whereas the Ruger one is just a bit more simple. And also on the Ruger, you'll see that the channel, the metal that surrounds it, is thicker. It's nicer. I like that better. On the Smith, it's a little thin. And sometimes the backside of it cannot quite come in contact with the body. That's something you should look out for on a new Smith, but this one here is pretty good. Although one thing I will say with the Ruger, it's kind of a double-edged sword, because even though it's thicker and looks, more substantial, the machining lines on it are horrible. Those are really bad. So that's kind of a strike against it as far as finish goes. Oh, and by the way, one more strike against the Ruger is that they seem to love putting things on the gun that I just don't think belong there, like read instruction manual, stuff like that. They just love that at Ruger. I hate that. And also in this picture, you can see those machining lines even more clearly. Now, if we move out to the actual muzzle of the gun, you can see they're a little different. I actually think I like the muzzle profile of the Smith & Wesson a little better, and I like how it's a different finish than the actual barrel. But I will say that on the Ruger, I much more like that deeper 45-degree crown as opposed to that very shallow crown on the Smith & Wesson. I just like the way it looks much better on the Ruger. Moving up to the top of the barrel and looking at the sights, well, in this case, Ruger does a better job. They have their front sight dovetailed in. You can change it a lot easier. You just tap out the old one, tap in a new one. On the Smith & Wesson, they still use those pinned front sights, where if you're going to change it, you got to put the new one in, drill it, and replace the pin. That's more trouble than I like to do. I don't like drilling on my guns. It's a chance to damage the gun, and that's a chance I really would not like to take. So I wish Smith & Wesson would move to easier to replace front sights. Now, on some of their in-frame guns, they've gone to a quick change front sight, but I haven't seen it yet on any K or L frame guns. If it exists on any K or L frame guns and you know about it, let me know too, because that would be a big improvement. And speaking of sights, the rear sights on the Ruger are also dovetailed in, which does give you some nice options. You can get the Novak style sights, all kinds of different aftermarket sights for it. The Smith & Wesson is a little more limited, but I will say they're easier to change since you don't have to tap anything out. But the Ruger ones usually have a set screw and they come in and out pretty easy. So I'm going to say that I like the Ruger rear sight a lot better. It's definitely more integrated into the gun, this style here. So I like the Ruger sight better than the Smith & Wesson. All right, next we'll move on to the body of the gun. And the first thing we'll look at here is the crane. Now the crane on the Ruger here actually looks like it's a little deeper, thicker than the one on the Smith & Wesson, but it's really not. It looks a little wider here because it actually has a little piece that lips over a part of the frame. The Smith & Wesson one goes all the way forward. It's one big solid piece. The Ruger has a little lip there to make room for a little mechanism on the body of the gun that isn't present on the Smith & Wesson. We'll talk about that more in a moment. But otherwise, not a whole lot of differences here other than one of the cylinders here is fluted. But you will notice one thing here, a little seam down here above the trigger guard. We'll talk more about that later. And one other thing you'll see here that's different is this little pin right here. This little pin is part of that little system I was talking about. It's there because the Ruger uses a lockup, a front lockup on the crane instead of on the end of the ejector rod. You can see the little slot there that it locks up in. And that's the piece that the front of the crane actually laps over. That isn't there on a Smith & Wesson. In fact, if you look here, you can see the little lapped over part of the crane, and you can see the actual mechanism in there, a little spring-loaded piece right there that locks into the actual frame of the gun, and that is what that little pin you saw on the outside is holding in place. I much prefer this lockup system. This one just seems so much stronger to me and seems like it does so much more than the Smith & Wesson one, but never had a problem with either, so I ain't really worried about it, but I do like the way the Ruger does it, although putting these extra pieces in here does change up things a little bit. If you'll notice here, they even file a little off the forcing cone to get everything to fit properly, so I'm not sure I love it, but it has never been a problem, and I do think it's stronger, so I'm fine with it. All right, now let's look at the triggers. As you can see here, both of them are hollow. They're very similar in design here, not a whole lot of difference. I do like the fact that the one on the Ruger matches the gun. I'm not crazy about the cheap case hardening on the Smith & Wesson ones, but I'm used to them, so it doesn't bother me much. And like I said, they're similar parts. Now you can see that little seam above the trigger guard again here, and we'll talk about that, like I said, more in a second. But first, let's look at the front of the triggers, and as you'll see here, both smooth, flat front triggers, no serrations on either of them when it comes to these two models, so no big differences here. Now let's look at the main body of the gun, where the cylinder's at. Now here you'll notice a big difference in design. You'll notice that over on the Smith & Wesson, like I've said before, they have that little piece of metal on the side that always looks deformed to me. It always looks bent to guide the cylinder back into place when you close the gun. It helps push in the little spring part so your cylinder locks in. And they use a little lip of metal that comes down the side to actually keep the cylinder from moving off of the actual ejector rod and off of the crane. Now on the Ruger, they have a beefier body. It has a rounded area right here, an almost tubular area right here, and they cut that guide for the cylinder right into that piece. I think that looks so much cleaner. Now, a lot of people don't like this. They think it looks cheap. I actually think it looks better. I think the one on the Smith & Wesson looks kind of cheap. Now let's move to the rear of the actual frame of the gun, and as you'll see here, there's a lot of difference. The Ruger has a much beefier body. It's a unibody design, and it's got that bumped up area there, and it's got more of a flat area above the actual grips. I just like the way they shape their guns much better than the Smith & Wesson. They kind of have an old style look to them. They look, even though these are not cowboy guns, they kind of have that cowboy gun feel because that rounded area at the back is very much like it is on a single action revolver. And of course here you'll see the biggest downfall of the Smith & Wesson here, and that is the lock. That lock on the Smith & Wesson is the worst thing I've ever seen. I even made a shirt design about that ugly blemish on the side of the gun and how much everyone dislikes it, yet Smith & Wesson is tied to it financially. Because, same company owns the company makes the little lock, safety lock, and Smith & Wesson. So they aren't going anywhere anytime soon, but those are just an eyesore. So when it comes to the lock, I can see where people would choose the Ruger just for that. And if we look a little closer at the rear of the gun here, we'll see another couple of big differences. One is how they do their cylinder release. The Smith & Wesson has a very traditional forward pushing release. You push it forward, it slides forward, it opens the cylinder. On the Ruger, it's a push button. You push a little button, opens the cylinder. A lot of people prefer that. I actually don't have a serious preference one way or the other on these two pieces. I like the way the Smith & Wesson looks with the extended Hogue cylinder release on here, but even when it's the standard release, they look very similar, but I do like how the Ruger has that rounded off area and it's kind of recessed into it. So aesthetically, I like it better, but functionally, they're about the same to me. Now, one other big difference you'll see here, and this is a weakness on Ruger's part, are the hammers. Now, the Smith & Wesson hammer isn't gorgeous, but it actually looks like a shaped machined piece. The Ruger hammers are awful. They're the worst. They look like someone took a reciprocating saw and cut a hammer shape out of a piece of steel and barely rounded off any of the edges. I've just never liked the way they do their hammers, although they are a little better now than they used to be. There's a little rounding to them, but still, they look cheap. And as you can see here, there's quite a bit of scuffing on it. That's because they don't mount them in there very solidly. They have a lot of wiggle. That's why whenever you get a tuning kit for a Ruger GP100, it always includes shims for the hammer because they are notoriously wiggly. So it's kind of a mixed bag here. Even though I think Smith & Wesson makes the hammer itself nicer, I do like the way the hammer is a bigger part of the design of the Ruger, how it matches the gun, and how it's kind of big and in your face, and it's like a substantial piece. I do like that better, but I just wish they would make them a little nicer. All right, now once we use those cylinder releases to open the gun up, you'll see inside they're pretty much the same. The cylinders are the same dimensions and they hold the same number of rounds. You can get either of these guns with 6 shots of 357 Magnum or with 7 shots of 357 Magnum. Now you can also get the GP100 in other calibers, but why would you when you can get 7 shots of 357 Magnum? Otherwise here, these are very similar, except that the way they lock the cylinder on the crane and the ejector rod, of course, is a little different. On the Smith & Wesson, you can see over here how they use that little piece that's on there. Ruger uses a different system and doesn't have that piece sitting there. All right, now let's go inside the gun, and the first thing we do is take off the grips, and you'll see a big difference here. As you can see, the Smith & Wesson uses a traditional full grip frame. You know, the front of the grip frame and the back strap of the grip frame, they're both designed to actually be exposed and be able to put your fingers on. You put a wood panel on both sides. Now you can get grips that wrap around the front, but they're not absolutely necessary. On the Ruger, they're absolutely necessary because it doesn't have a grip frame. It has a grip tang. And that requires the grip to surround it completely. No part of it is made for your hands to touch it. And that is a difference you'll notice right off the bat when you take the grips off. You'll also notice they use a completely different spring system here. To power the hammer on the Smith & Wesson, it has a traditional leaf style spring like you'd find on an old truck. And it attaches to the hammer with a stirrup. Now on the Ruger, they use a hammer strut with a coiled spring. You know, that strut and spring construction is more like the suspension you would see on a car. Now, the strut doesn't actually attach to the hammer with a stirrup like it does on the Smith. It actually just inserts into a slot on the actual hammer. And that's one of the major differences between these two guns, is that they use a different type of spring system and connection to the actual hammer. Now is where that seam on the trigger guard I was telling you about earlier comes in. The Ruger does not have a side plate. It is a unibody design. And some people love that. Some people hate it. Some people don't care one way or the other. I'm kind of more the latter. I don't really care. It is nice. I like the shape of it, but I can take or leave either one of these mechanisms here. Now, the one thing I will say about the Ruger is, since it does use the unibody here, when you take it apart, it looks completely different. And people think, oh my God, this is so much different than the way the Smith operates. But it isn't. It's almost identical in most every way. If you look at the actual functioning parts of the gun here, you'll see the really big difference is that since they are in a unibody in the Ruger, they're attached more to that trigger guard that actually comes off. Now, the whole trigger guard comes off. I've actually removed it here to give me more space to show the parts, but that would be the entire trigger and trigger guard that comes out there. And most of the internal parts that attach to the trigger or the hammer are actually based in that, housed in that piece right there, instead of being on pins or in slots in the actual body of the gun where you can access it with a side plate. because you can't mount the pieces inside with pins and slots if there's no way to access them because it's a unibody. That's why they're a little different. But if you look at the actual parts here, they're almost identical. If you look at the hammer, it's very similar to the hammer on the Smith & Wesson. If you look at the Smith & Wesson one, it has its double action sear here. That's what makes the gun work in double action. Over here on the Ruger hammer, they have the same piece, although they call it a hammer dog or something weird like that. That's what works the hammer when you pull the trigger in double action. And just like how the top surface of the rear section on the trigger interacts with that to make it work in double action on the Smith, it does the same thing on the Ruger. You can also see the little parts on the rear of the trigger of the Smith & Wesson that interact with the hammer to act as a single action sear, and you can see the same parts on the Ruger. Very similar. The only real part you're missing on the hammer of the Ruger is, like I said, that stirrup or saddle or whatever you want to call it there. It isn't on the Ruger. They don't have one. Another thing here that might look really different, but actually isn't that different, is the trigger rebound. On the Smith & Wesson, it's the rebound slide here and the trigger rebound spring. And the actual slide moves backwards and forwards on the spring. It's sandwiched there in between the moving parts of the gun. On the Ruger, the actual slide part doesn't really slide. It's just a body. But it does the same thing, really. It just has an internal spring, like the Smith does, that moves little plungers at both ends, and they move on an internal spring inside the gun, and that's really the difference. Functionally, they do the same thing, and they look very similar when you think about it. They just do it in a slightly different way. And then when it comes to the other parts like, the paw or the hand, you can see here there's one on the Smith & Wesson attached to the trigger. There's one here on the Ruger attached to the trigger. Now, if you could see the actual hammer block on the Smith & Wesson, it'd be right here, and it's a hammer block, as I just said. On the Ruger, that's a little different because it's actually a transfer bar. In this case, it's more similar to the Colt we looked at the other day. Just a little safety to keep that hammer from striking the firing pin when you're not actually pulling the trigger, just they do it in different ways. And just one last thing here that the Ruger does a little differently is the actual cylinder latch or bolt, as some people call it. On the Smith & Wesson, there's an integral part of the trigger that actually interacts with that when you pull it. On the Ruger, you can see right here, there's a piece called the trigger plunger that actually interacts with the cylinder stop or bolt, and that's a slight difference here. It's just, one piece that's part of the trigger on the Smith & Wesson has been made a separate piece on the Ruger. That's just one little thing Ruger does differently. I'm not exactly sure why they do it differently. I just know they do. So as you can see, when you look at the internals of these guns, when you look at them mechanically, they're almost the same. There's some slight differences, but overall, they do the same things with pretty much the same parts. They just do them in a slightly different way. And most of that difference is because of that unibody construction. I think the Ruger is a little more complex simply because it does have more parts, it does have more springs, it does have more little plungers and things like that. But both of them are very practical, reliable, time-proven mechanisms, and they'll both do just fine. So when you're trying to decide between these two guns, a Smith & Wesson 686 and a Ruger, it used to be the Ruger was a lot cheaper. So it was a really good buy, a good idea to get the Ruger if you want to save a little money and still have a very good gun. Now, the Smith & Wesson is still, even though the prices have gotten closer, a little more mechanically refined than the Ruger. It's also a little more engineered than the Ruger. But there's not that big of a difference. And sometimes it'll just come down on these two guns to which one you like the looks of better. Or which one do you like the looks of least if you don't like the lock, which a lot of people don't and won't buy Smith & Wesson because of that. In that case, the Ruger is a perfectly good option. But if you're really wanting the gun that is slightly better, you'd probably go with the Smith & Wesson. But in this case, these guns are both so similar and have such a different look, though, and can appeal to people in different ways. I think no matter which one you choose, you were right and you made a good decision.